In the last section, we saw how we could create a document that had an embedded subdocument inside of it. We will look at some of the advanced features or advanced ideas around subdocuments, but really quick, I realized that we're kind of missing one thing here. We've seen how we can create a new user that has a list of posts embedded inside of it at the exact time that we create the user, but we haven't really figured out how do we actually add subdocuments to an existing records that has been saved to our collection. So in theory, once a user inside of a imaginary web application that we haven't built yet has been created, maybe over time they want to come back and add some more posts, right? Totally makes sense. So we need to figure out some way in which we can take an existing saved user and then add in some new documents into their subdocument collection of posts. So I think that maybe a good use of time would be to write another test and figure out exactly how we add or remove subdocuments inside of a user model. So we'll start off first by adding new posts to an existing user. So let's write out the shell of a test, and then we'll figure out exactly how we're going to approach it. So we'll say it can add subdocuments to an existing record. Now we'll certainly have a lot of asynchronous code in here, so we'll remember our done callback. So now we need to think about exactly how we want to test this. This is going to be a little bit more involved test sequence than a lot of the existing tests that we've made so far. In theory, we kind of want to create a record, save it, then pull it out of our database, add a post to it, and then make sure that the post actually gets saved appropriately. So let's take a look at a diagram that's going to help us understand the exact order of operations. So yeah, this is going to be a little bit nasty when you look at this diagram. Our goal is going to be to create an instance of Joe and save him to the database. We'll then fetch Joe from Mongo. We'll add a post to him. We will then save that updated model, the one that now has a post attached to it. We'll then fetch Joe back out of the database, and finally we'll make an assertion. So we're going to have a little bit of extra work inside of here where we're going to not only create Joe, save him, fetch him, which is what we've been doing many times so far, but we're also going to make another update to him, save him, and fetch him again. So this is going to be some more advanced use of promises inside of this test, without a doubt. The one thing that I want to tell you about subdocuments right now, and this is something that we're going to see in practice quite a bit, is that you can only save subdocuments inside of a parent model by adding it to the parent, which for us is the user. Here, let's see a better diagram here. Okay, this is better. The only way that we can save a subdocument inside of a user is by first adding that subdocument and then calling save on the model itself, so on the user. Even though we created a post schema, we do not have a post model. So there's no idea of kind of like embedding a post inside of a user and then saving just the post. We can't save just the post by itself. We have to save the entire user. So we'll see that in practice as soon as we start working on this test. But I just want to mention it ahead of time because that's a very common question to have. Okay, so let's go back to our test. So we know that we first need to create a user Joe and save him. So we've done that many times. Let's get started with that. I'll say const Joe is a new user. I'll give him a name of Joe, and then I'm going to initialize their list of posts to an empty array. Now I don't actually have to do this right here. I don't actually have to initialize posts to be an empty array. The reason I'm doing this is just for the purposes of our test. I want any engineer who is reading this test in the future to be 100% clear that, okay, Joe is starting off with a specifically empty array of posts. So now we can save Joe. So we'll say joe.save, and then we'll fetch him from our database. So we'll say user find one, and just grab me Joe. So as we've seen many times so far with our promises, when this query right here runs, if we chain on another .then, this callback or this .then will be called with the result of user find one. So we'll get a function here that is called with the user that gets fetched. The reason I'm reiterating that is because we're going to add on a lot of .thens inside of here, and so it really pays to address a little bit of extra attention to the return value or the argument that's passed into each of these subsequent .thens. So we have now saved Joe, we fetched Joe, Let's take a look at our diagram just to make sure we're going down the right path here. We created Joe, saved him, fetched him. So now we want to add a new post to Joe. So this is where the real, heart of what we're trying to accomplish inside this test comes into play. To add a new record inside of a subdocument collection, we will say user.posts, which is an array, right? Like we've seen that so far. This is going to be an array, and we will push a new record inside of there. We're going to push in a new post with a title of new post. So the magic here is that there's really no magic at all. Array push is a very common JavaScript operation. This is like something that you'll probably learn on day 1 or 2 of picking up JavaScript. When you want to add an element to an existing array of records, you can say array.push and then pass in the record or whatever item it is that you want to append to your array. And so we are making use of existing JavaScript conventions here by saying, okay, we've got a list of posts already. I want to just push a new record inside of there. Just pushing this new record inside of that list of posts, however, does not actually save the record. So just because we were adding in this new post to this list of posts, this doesn't actually get reflected into our database. Remember, the only way that we can save a record is by calling user.save. So I'm going to call user.save. And with this right here, this will recognize that, okay, we have added in a new post to our list of posts. We need to persist that to our database. So if we look at our diagram now, we have added a post to Joe, we have saved Joe, and now we need to fetch him again and then make the assertion. Now the one gotcha inside of here, we're going to go back to talking about promises a little bit. Remember that with fat arrow functions, which is what we have right here, if we omit the curly braces, like so, we get, or if we do not have these, just to be clear, which is what I just had before, we get an implicit return of whatever is inside of the arrow function. So what I mean by that is what we are looking at right here is equal and equivalent to doing return user find one and placing some curly braces around it. This return right here, like actually returning the promise that find one generates, is what makes this dot then right here actually work. Okay, so because we are returning the promise, we can chain on the dot then and everybody's happy. So just to be clear, that's why we're using a fat arrow here without any curly braces or anything like that. The same thing is applicable with this user.save. So we're now using curly braces in here, which means we do not get an automatic return statement out of this function. But we still want to chain on another dot then to this overall promise structure right here to make sure that we get a callback whenever the user is successfully saved. So because of that, because I have to return a promise from this thing if I want to chain on another result, I will say return.save, user.save. So now that I'm returning this promise right here, I can add on another dot then that will only be called once the user has been successfully saved. So now, inside of another callback, we can pull out the user that was just saved one last time. So here's my find one. Oops, let's do there we go. And then after the user is again pulled out of our database, we can finally make an assertion about them. So this will be called with the user that just got pulled out. So now this user right here, I would expect to have access to exactly one post inside of its collection of posts, and it should have a title of new post. So we can write in another assertion. Assert user posts at 0 dot title. We'll have a title of new post. And finally, we can call our done. All right, so this was definitely a much more fancy little bit of test setup here. Let's check out our terminal and make sure that our tests are actually running. Okay, 18 passing, definitely looks good. If I delete new out of here, I can save, and fantastic. Okay, so it looks like everything is, we got a reasonable feeling that everything is running properly. So again, the magic inside of this assertion right here was that we wanted to do a series of operations, and we did it by chaining on a bunch of promises with each other. One of the big curveballs here was that inside of this second dot then, we wanted to make sure that the subsequent dot then was only called after the save operation was successfully done. Because we were using a fat arrow function with curly braces, we did not get an implicit or automatic return of user.save, so we had to add in the return statement right here. Just to reiterate on that point one more time, all the other locations where we've been using user.find1 without any curly braces, that means that the find1 statement was automatically getting returned for us, and so the subsequent .then was waiting for the find1 operation to wrap up. The last big thing that I want to say about adding subdocuments to an existing record is just a reminder, when we push a new record into this collection or list of posts right here, we have to save the user, the entire user, in order for that post to be saved. There's no such thing as saying like, oh, just find this one single post inside of here and call .save on it. That doesn't work. We have to save the entire record and send it off to our database. Okay, so we've now seen how we add subdocuments to an existing collection. Just for posterity's sake, I would really like to go through the process of removing a record as well, a subdocument. In practice, it's going to look basically identical to what we've got right here, but I think that our test suite and all these examples would be really more complete by adding in the process of removing a document as well. So let's continue the next section and get on top of removing a record. It's going to look a lot, very similar to what we did just right here, so we should be able to get through it pretty quickly. So let's take a quick break and then tackle removing subdocuments.